We are very fortunate this week to have one of our very own colleagues presenting an exciting paper on the effects of corporate governance on CEO employment risk. And this is a piece of work that brings together many important areas in academia, from accounting, finance, governance, hence of interest. But I would like to take this opportunity to welcome Kemi and to introduce Kemi, who is, I suppose, very well known to most of us here. But it's always in order that the speaker gets a good a highlight of their work. Kemi joined SOAS, University of London, in 2019 as the first ever professor of accounting in the history of SOAS of 100 years. So this is a landmark. And she's a qualified chartered accountant, and at the same time, a professor of accounting and finance here in the School of Finance and Management at SOAS. And therefore, combining all the credentials of practice in accounting, auditing, and related areas, but also the intellectual gravitas or based on research, which adds a very important dimension to the professional qualification that she holds. Kemi researches across key mainstream areas in both accounting and finance, but her research principally focuses on aspects of corporate disclosure practices from an interdisciplinary perspective, and especially paying particular attention to transparency, quality of narrative disclosures, corporate governance and bank performance, and actually producing innovations of new scientific ways of capturing information from semiotics, which she has been very proud to lead and to champion, and introducing us at SOAS and in academia to their whole world of being able to capture information. And her research has been produced in published in a very reputable international journals, including Business and Society, Accounting Forum, Accounting, Auditing and Accountability, Journal of Financial Crime, which she plays an important role also in uncovering financial crime. The forensic aspects of Kemi's work is also very important here. And she has held many leadership positions before joining SOAS. At the Leicester Business School, she founded and provided leadership to the Center for Research in Accountability, Governance, and Sustainability, CRAGS. And this was a multidisciplinary research center, but building on her Kemi's research in accounting and finance. And this center was, of course, very instrumental in winning research grants and then developing projects, sometimes in partnership with our practitioners. But she later joined the University of Nottingham as the Director of Research for the Accounting Division, and indeed was the Divisional Director of the PhD program while she was there, a position that she now occupies in the School of Finance and Management, and producing very innovative ways of expanding and enhancing the viability of the PhD program. But suffice it to add here to add a dimension of her practice, her professional practice. She has indeed held various leadership roles in industry and accounting professional practices as a senior auditor, auditor in charge of various audit assignments, head of internal auditor, and later the head of finance, sitting at the top of the finance function in corporate. So she's well informed when she's talking about corporate governance issues. She has had the experience, she's had the board level experience, interfacing with the board, and especially if we are on the same persuasion that finance drives everything in a corporate setting. And she had over 19 years of professional practice in industry before joining academia in 2007. And of course, she has supervised a number of PhD theses, and maybe there will be some people in this audience that Kemi has touched on the professional expertise, including, of course, the current cohort of PhD students that Kemi helps us to lead. She has also been very active in editing journals, has held many editorial positions, including editorial board member of Advances in Environmental Accounting and Management, editor-in-chief of ICT ACT, Journal of Management Studies, and scientific committee member of the Global Conference in Business and Economics. I could go on and go on, but maybe I do not want to cut short of the time, but we are very fortunate today that we have our very own Kemi and very eminent in both professional practice and research. And it's from those backgrounds that she draws to be able to present her current research on the effects of corporate governance on CEO employment risk. It's a great pleasure, Kemi, to welcome you, and may I ask you now to go ahead with the presentation of your seminar. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Victor. Thanks for the introduction. I hope my voice is clear. I hope you can hear me well.
We can hear you very, very, very well, yes.
Okay, so I'll just go ahead to share my PowerPoint presentation.
Yeah.
Yes,
excellent.
has rightly introduced the topic as effect of corporate governance on CEO employment risk. Maybe the first question we want to ask is, what do we mean by CEO employment risk? And I'm going to employ the definition of Chakraborty et al. That says CEO employment risk refers to the possibility or likelihood of being dismissed from office before the expiration of the employment contract. Now, this topic, to us, we believe, it's maybe I should let you know that it's a topic that I'm considering with a colleague from one of my previous institutions. Her name is Miriam. We've done a number of work together, but this one we, we've been looking at various studies on corporate governance, and most of the time you will see that such studies are focused mainly on the effect of corporate governance on profitability, on performance, on how well the firm is doing. Most of corporate governance studies are focused around that. And, authors will look at what directors' influence, directors' network, directors' connectedness, the board size, and all of these things have been widely researched. Now, one thing that has been omitted from these various studies is the effect of this governance process, the monitoring mechanism that has been put together as a result of, agency problem. What effect does it have on the CEO who has been employed to be at the ends of affairs of the organization, taking decisions, liaising directly with the board to, drive the company forward? What effect does it have on the employment status or employment risk of this group of individuals, of these executives? So we thought it's a very important topic, and we decided to explore the topic. And we, like I said, is very, very raw. We've put it together. I mean, the structure is in place. We've written, done some literature review around it. We've done some data collection. We've also done some analysis, but we're still working on it before submitting. We don't even know what journal would love to have this sort of work. We've not decided on the journal, but we just thought, let's do the work, let's get it done, and then will think of what journal to send it to. And so I would welcome, feedback that could help enhance the paper, that could, probably see through to, maybe one of the ABS 3-star journal. So that's how we have defined employment risk. That is the risk that the CEO may lose their job, either as a result of being dismissed or them having to leave before the expiration of their contract. So now, a lot of people have looked at something similar, but usually they've looked at performance and termination of executives from their role. The reason why we think it is important to look at a topic like this is because the removal of CEO from their position will not only affect the CEO, definitely we know it will have an effect on the CEO itself, but it will also have some impact on the organization as well. For the CEO, we do know that, of course, it can lead to loss of reputation, probably inability to find another job, because if they have been fired as a result of poor performance, the tendency for them not to, get employed by some other firm is very high. And of course, that will lead to loss of income for such CEOs. But also it could have implication for the strategic decisions of the firm, because then there will be instability in, decision making. The new CEO might also not, realizing that the former CEO was fired for poor performance. They might be nervous, they might not be able to carry on the whatever decision or strategic, decision that the previous CEO has made. They might not be able to carry on the activity. They might also be fidgety, and, it definitely will have effect on the performance of the organization. So that is why we think it is important to find out what are those things that could jeopardize CEOs' employment. What are those things, those factors, apart from, like I said, so many people have looked at performance and, employment risk, or and the dismissal of CEO. But then, could there be other reasons why CEOs are not performing? And that's what we are trying to look at. And we felt corporate governance mechanisms itself might actually be done in such a way that it puts the CEO at risk of losing their job. And that was why we decided to explore this. Chakraborty et al. Provided evidence that CEOs facing high termination risk might engage in less risk-taking activities. You see, that is one of the reasons why it is important to find out what could jeopardize their, their employment status, what could put them at risk of losing their job. Because if a CEO realizes that they are at risk of losing their job, it makes them nervous, and, it might prevent them from taking activities that they might consider risky. And of course, we know that the higher the risk, the higher the return. So if they are afraid of taking risk, if they are risk averse as a result of wanting to secure their job, definitely it will have another effect on their performance, and of course will also affect, put them at risk of losing their employment. So it's like a vicious circle. Nervousness will make them to perform less, and poor performance will, of course, also affect their employment status. And so what are those things, that could put CEO on in that kind of position? And we thought corporate governance, yes, has been put in place to monitor the performance of CEO and other executives, but could it also be a determinant to why CEO might face, this sort of situation of, being afraid of losing their job at all the time? And authors like Fidelisi and Risi also found strong negative relationship between farm performance and CEO turnover. So, that is, if the performance of performance in terms of, how is the company doing? Are they making profit? Are they achieving their set objectives or their goals? So if performance is poor, according to this study, CEO turnover, as in CEO losing their job or leaving their job, is higher. And that's why they have that negative inverse relationship. So we also realized that from previous studies that we reviewed, most study points to poor performance as major determinant of CEO dismissals. So most of the study looked at, the CEO is performing poorly, and so that's why they are dismissed. And there are so many studies around that. But what could lead to poor performance, apart from them perhaps not taking the right decision or taking risk that they are not able to manage, and as a result leads to this? And could it also be influenced by the sort of governance that they are that they are receiving from the board? So, and that's what prompts us to say, okay, let's look beyond performance as determinants of CEO turnover or employment risk. Let's also look beyond corporate governance, promoting good corporate governance as a way of having positive outcome. Let's look beyond that. Let's look at corporate governance itself as a tendency to create employment risk for the CEO, which is funny. Corporate governance is supposed to, add to the effectiveness of the CEO and therefore good performance. But can corporate governance itself be an issue at putting the CEO employment status at risk? So those are the things we are questioning. And we thought, yes, it's good to look beyond corporate governance outcomes by examining the effect of corporate governance on the personal risk of the decision makers. So why did we decide to do that? We wanted to see the likelihood of CEO being dismissed, as from the corporate governance perspective, because it could be used to predict future performance as well. And it could help us to determine the objectivity of CEO's decision. Why are they taking certain decisions? Could it be that they are under pressure of, meeting with the board's strategic goals? Or could it be that the board themselves, given their own ineffectiveness, is what is affecting the CEO, and that's why they are taking the sort of decision they are taking? And so our main objective, therefore, is to test whether board effectiveness or ineffectiveness might mean higher employment risk for the CEO, and whether CEO on their part, as a result of their network or connectedness, can actually have a mitigating effect on this employment risk. So we are looking at it from two angles. One, can board effectiveness, we measure board effectiveness with various variables, board size, board composition, frequency of board meeting, and so many other things. Now, what we are saying is, can this board effectiveness have a negative effect on the CEO's employment status? And if so, can CEO's own network have a mitigating effect on their employment risk? So that's what we are trying to look at. And so we borrowed insight from the agency theory and the resource dependency theory to come up with our research question, and also to help us in developing our hypothesis. And so from agency theory and resource dependency perspective, we asked the question, to what extent does the effectiveness of the board of directors and the CEO network determine the CEO employment risk? So we are looking at the two. So our independent variable, therefore, is board effectiveness, which we are going to measure using board size and board independence. And then we want to look at the CEO network. So if board effectiveness and board size, all of those mechanisms, if it's affecting the CEO's employment risk, or if it's increasing CEO's employment risk, per chance, can that be mitigated by CEO's network? So that's why we are combining all that. So empirically, therefore, we hope to examine the relationship between board effectiveness on one hand and it affecting CEO employment risk, while also exploring the mitigating effect of CEO network or CEO connectedness. You will agree with me that most of the time in corporate governance literature, what you will see is board network, the board of directors network. No one has really looked at the CEO network as well, and what effect it could have both on the firm and on CEO themselves. So here in this paper, what we are looking at it from the point of view of it assisting the CEO to be able to either retain their job or at least be able to secure another one in case they lose their job. So that's the angle we are looking at it from. So how did we arrive at our hypothesis? We do know that agency theory, because of the agency problem created by separation of power and control, necessitated having monitoring mechanisms which led to the formation of the board, and all of those board characteristics that we have studied in corporate governance. So what we are saying is that if the board and the effectiveness of the board is meant to monitor the CEO, right? Could it then mean that the likelihood of CEO employment risk would increase with increased board effectiveness? Like I said earlier, it's funny to reason, the way we are reasoning, because ordinarily, what we would expect is that board effectiveness should improve CEO performance, right? That's what let me say, that's what we've been orientated to believe. Yeah, we've all been oriented to believe that board effectiveness should actually increase CEO performance and at the same time, the firm performance. But what we are saying is, would CEO stand the risk of losing their job with increased board effectiveness? And that's what we are trying to look at. It's funny, like I said, but we are just reasoning to see, yes, it is good to be positive all the time to say board effectiveness is necessary for CEO employment, for CEO effectiveness and for firm performance. But could it also be endangering the CEO's employment status? And that's what we want to see. And so we are measuring board effectiveness by board size and board independence. So, excuse me. Also, from resource dependency perspective, we do know that external resources, and if you look at corporate governance literature, resource dependency has been used a lot to justify board of directors network and how resources they get from outside, from external to the firm, can help to improve the performance of the firm. And so it is encouraged that the board of directors should have a network that can then endear the firm to external resources that will then help with the firm performance. But then we are looking at it from the point of view of the CEO. So we are saying if CEO is well connected, maybe they've served so many other boards in the past, they've worked with some other organization where they are the darling of the board of directors there, or they have even served as member of board in some companies. Can this help to mitigate against them losing their job? their current position wherever they are. So, and what we are expecting there is that, as CEO get connected and exposed to external resources, it can enhance their performance in their current role. And so even if there is any mitigating effect from the board perspective, the CEO can maintain their job because of what they are getting from their external network. And so we are trying to look at, can the connection of CEO, can it help them, therefore, to retain their job, even if they are having, a corresponding negative effect from their current board? I don't know if I'm making sense, but it will all make sense. It will all tie up later when you see the nature of the data we collected. Okay, so we are looking at a panel study, and we've taken sample from 2007 to 2020. And we are still collecting more data because we want to make it up to 2021. So we want it to be a 15-year period. In actual fact, we are thinking of looking at also the effect of the crisis period, that's 2007-10, but that is not included in this presentation. So that's why we collected from 2007 and up to date. Okay, so the population is from the 350 non-financial firms, and the reason we excluded financial firms is, as you would have known, there is difference in the method of accounting revenue and profit for financial and non-financial firm. Also, we do know that financial firms have special regulatory requirements, and so we excluded all financial firms, and so our population is based on only non-financial firms. So now this is the definition of variables and also the various variables that we controlled for. So our dependent variable, like I said, is employment risk. How have we measured employment risk? Now, we borrow from this scholar, Martin and colleague, their approach to measuring the risk of losing employment by top executives. And what they did was that they used a dummy variable where they give one to, if there is, for that, in that paper they use 3 years, but we use 2 years. 2 years consecutive decline in stock price that also coincide with 2-year decline in profitability. And in this paper, we measure profitability by return on assets and then 0 otherwise. So the dummy variable assume a 1 value if there is 2 years consecutive decline in stock price that also coincide with 2 years consecutive decline in profitability. So the reason we use 2 years is because normally the board will not fire a CEO for poor performance in the first year. So let's say a CEO, whether new or an existing CEO, perform poorly in a particular year, it is not expected that they will be fired that year. Also, by the end of the second year, it is still not expected that they will be fired, but of course, their employment at that point is at risk. But if at the third year there is another decline, as described in our table, that is decline in stock prices that coincide with decline in profitability. So what we are saying is that by the time this happened again the third year, it is very likely that that CEO might be fired. At the end of the second year, they might be called to question. I mean, they might be called to attend the board meeting to justify why they should continue to have losses, fall in stock price, and then the company also not reporting good profits. So, but by the time this happened again the third year, what we are saying is that there is a tendency that such CEO might lose their job. So that's why we measured employment risk using 2 years consecutive decline in stock price and 2-year consecutive decline in profitability. So we give it a 1 value if that has happened with any firm, and 0 if that is not the case. Now, the reason why we use 2 commonly used performance measure is because ROA, as we all know, is an accounting measure, and accounting figures are characterized by estimates, and so we don't want to rely solely on accounting measure of performance, and that was why we use the stock price also, so we can use both measure of performance, market performance, and the accounting measure. So if both of them at the same time is having decline in the first year, decline in the second year, then we are saying it is very likely that the job of that CEO is at risk. Okay, so our dependent variable, our independent variables, that is the variables we are really interested in, is the board size as a measure of board effectiveness and the board independence, both of which we collected from Bodex. And board size is number of directors on the company's board, while board independence is ratio of non-executive directors on the board. We measure return on assets as a ratio of net income to total assets. We got that from data stream, and stock price as change in value of stock price at the end of the fiscal year. Also, we collected that from data stream. Other things we collected from Bodex are the CEO network, that number of boards the CEO has served to date. That's how we measure the connectedness of the CEO. Then we controlled for CEO tenure. That is how long CEO has been in this current role in years. We also got that from Bodex. The CEO age, the age of the CEO in years. CEO wealth, what are some of equity held or value of options or long-term incentives that the CEO holds. So we got all of that from Bodex, and we also control for firm size, that is the size of the company, which is measured by market capitalization, leverage, that is ratio of long-term debt to capital, and then firm risk. That's the volatility of the stock price. So all of these we got from data stream. Now, these are all just to control, because we know that employment risk might also be affected by the tenure, the age. So these are all just control variables. So, but the variables we are really interested in is the board effectiveness and the network of the CEO. So the data analysis method, we use Probit model because, like I said, our dependent variable is dichotomous with 1 or 0. And so we cannot use OLS regression, linear regression, because if we model linear regression, it will violate OLS assumption. And so Probit model seems appropriate for this sort of variables. And that is why we have used Probit. So, and that's the model that we've formed. So that's board size, board independence, and CEO network, like I said, and then all the control variables in there. So we ran so many regressions, while we were doing this. As you will agree with me that, when you are doing regression analysis, you have to run it so many times, changing the variables at each time. So what we did, because we wanted to see the effect of each of these independent variable on employment risk. So we added them one after the other, and then we added them together as well. So for example, in model 1, we only included board size and excluded board independence and CEO network. And you can see that the board size is positively related to employment risk and is also significant at 1%. So we can see the p-value at 1% here. Although the coefficient is small, but then it is significant. And that's the Z score. It is equivalent of the T statistics. So we also did board independence alone and got similar results to board size. And then we added board size to this model. Initially, we did the model without board size, and we achieved this result. And then we added board size to it, and the result is still very similar. And board size still remain significant even after including it with board independence. Okay, we then did CEO network alone, and we obtained an inverse relationship between CEO network and employment risk, which means if the employment risk reduces with CEO network, although with very small coefficient, and then also not significant. And that actually put us on inquiry, when we saw that the CEO network is not significant, although it still shows that the inverse relationship still shows that the more the CEO is connected, the lower their employment risk. But then the insignificant results was of a concern to us. And so what we did therefore is that we try to correct for endogeneity, because as is normal with most corporate governance literature, you will notice that endogeneity is always an issue, and especially in a situation like this where we are talking about employment risk being an issue with board effectiveness. And then, so it could also be vice versa. So we thought, let's correct for endogeneity, because if we don't address the endogeneity problem, we will get inconsistent results, and which, of course, we cannot rely on. So for example, we know that although we can say poor performance can lead to CEO turnover, but again, CEO with prior information about poor performance can also decide to quit their job. So which means either can affect each other, which is the endogeneity issue we are talking about. And for our particular paper, we discovered that since large boards, from various literature, we have seen that large boards could result in poor performance because of the lack of coordination, among large boards. We know that, authors have provided evidence that when the board is large, they tend to take longer to arrive at decision, and which, of course, could slow down the strategic decision also by the CEO, and can eventually lead to poor performance. So since that is an issue, so we thought that if large board could result in poor performance, and which of course put the CEO employment at risk, then we argue that employment risk may also affect board size, because when there is high turnover in the CEO of a company, it can also lead to poor performance and therefore increase in board size. Because when there is poor performance, what you see is that the board will get to work and they think, oh, perhaps we are not doing well enough, and that is why there's this turnover in CEO or poor performance, and which could also increase board size. So we thought, okay, since this could be an endogeneity issue, that we could resolve this issue by modeling board size using instrumental variable. And so we use the instrumental variable Probit estimate technique to solve this endogeneity issue. And in order to do this, we identify a variable which we think can serve as an instrumental variable for board size, which is not also related to CEO employment, and that is average broad group network. So we assume that if the board network increases, it could also increase, you know, if board size increases, it could also increase the board network. And the higher the board network, you know, the better for the firm. And so we thought, okay, this is not related to employment rates. It doesn't sound as something that could affect employment rates. So let's use it to measure board size as an instrumental variable, so that we can then see the effect of this on CEO employment risk. And so we estimated that and ran our regression again. Well, one thing that we noticed immediately after running this regression is that CEO network became significant. Remember that in the previous model, it was not significant, and the coefficient was very, very low. But we can see here that it maintained its sign, that is the inverse relationship, but then it became marginally significant. And the other variables, that is board size and board independence, also remained significant. And not only are they significant, but this time around, the coefficient increased. If we go back to the previous table, we see that the coefficient in our previous model was 193, here 0.193, while the Z-score is 0.046. Same with model 2, where we have both board size and board independence. And also, if you look at the CEO network, the coefficient is 0.006 and the Z-score is 0.018. But then if you look at if you look at the model after including the instrumental variable, you will see that the coefficient increased as well as the Z-score. So which shows that our instrumental variable actually worked. But then we see that the various variables still maintained their significance, and the CEO network now became significant as well. And all of the other control variables also maintained their significance. If we go back, you will see that they all maintained their significance. So what's the summary of this? Okay, yeah, before I go to the summary, because I presented this paper somewhere, and someone mentioned that we could use an alternative measure of employment risk. And so we decided to use an alternative measure of employment risk. Remember, the measure of employment risk that we use in the previous model is that if there is consecutive decline in performance, both market and accounting performance in 2 years, we feel that that CEO is at a risk of losing their job. But then we employed this other one where we felt, okay, if CEO has been, if a particular company has fired their CEO in the last few years, then we can as well say the current CEO is also at a risk of losing their job. So we measured employment risk therefore as 1. It's still dichotomous, so we still give 1 if company changed CEO in prior years, and 0 otherwise. So the reason why we use this, although this was suggested by somebody in the seminar I presented it at, and the reason for this is that, if a CEO gets a job and they realize that in previous years, previous CEO has been fired, for lack of performance, they will become fidgety as well. They'll become nervous, because if I assume a role and I realize that the last 2 CEO were fired by the board, of course, I will be a bit nervous, because that means I am also not safe. So if there's any error on my part, it means I'm going to be fired as well. So we take that to be an employment risk. And so we measured employment risk using 1 if that has happened and 0 otherwise. And we ran our model again. So although now using this measure of employment risk, we find that the significance of our variables, became marginal, not at 1% like we saw in the previous models, but they are still significant at 10%. And you can see that they are still positively related to employment risk. And the CEO CEO network, you can see is also still inversely related, which shows that the more connected the CEO is, the lower their risk of losing their job. And it's also marginally significant. So all of these results is boiling down to the following. So it shows that the likelihood of CEO employment risk increases with increased board size, as you can see from the results. And like I said, this may mean that the coordination problem that we see with large boards, which could, inadvertently lead to poor performance, can threaten the CEO employment. So, the board may think they are being effective by increasing the number of members they have on board. But the problem is that because they are usually slow when it is large board, they are slow at taking strategic decision. This may also affect the decision-making process of the CEO, which eventually could lead to poor performance. And of course, poor performance could lead to the CEO, losing their job. So which means large board can actually be an employment risk for the CEO. So that's what we can bring out from that. Similarly, board independence, we can see, increases the likelihood of CEO employment risk. Well, in this case, we measured board independence there as number of non-executive directors on board. What this can suggest to us is that the effective board is constantly actively monitoring the activities of the CEO and would likely not, fail to discipline any CEO that is poorly performing. And of course, that means it puts the CEO's job at risk. And so the more effective the board is, the more likely that the CEO might lose their job if they are not forthcoming, if they are not up and doing. So, but we also saw that CEO network could reduce this likelihood of them losing their job, which means that CEO with more networks can act as an important resource provider to the firm so that they are less likely to be dismissed, because that would therefore enhance their performance. And of course, when they perform well, they are not likely to lose their job. So that's the summary of findings. And the implication, therefore, is that large firm size should not necessarily mean large boards, because as we have seen even from previous studies, that large boards we know would slow down decision-making process and might also be a hindrance to the CEO also being effective on their own job. It also implies that board should be made up of more independent directors who can effectively monitor the activities of the CEO, and therefore ensure that they put the CEO on their feet to be sure they are performing well. And it also implies that, as the sayings goes, that information is power. When CEOs are connected, when they are well connected to different organizations, they can get valuable information that will then help them in their job and will also assist them to retain their job. So we think this is novel because we have not seen anybody look at this. And we see it as a worthwhile work that we think we want to publish. But then I would welcome feedback that could enhance it. As you can see, provide fresh evidence that apart from performance, corporate governance mechanism may also determine CEO employment risk. And it also contributes to the agency and resource dependency literature. And so we think it's timely given the recent global demand for board effectiveness and adequate monitoring of executive. And that brings me to the end of the presentation, and I would welcome feedback that would enhance the work. Thank you for listening.
Thank you indeed, Kemi, for such an interesting presentation, very well and clearly presented, innovative in many ways of engaging with the literature, interesting hypothesis you put forward, very clear and encompassing model, and which you tested with a large number of observations, a large number, and a large data set, and very interesting results generated, very plausible as well, with the important policy implications. So well done, very interesting indeed. I think what we're gonna do now is go around and ask for some comments and feedback on what Kemi and colleague have done here. Kemi did indicate that this is a work in progress, and therefore any constructive criticism and suggestions would be highly welcome. And you may want to use the raise hand part on the reactions, and then you can indicate you that you want to raise a question. Okay, who will go first? Let's go first. Okay. Okay, yeah. Slight, your hand is up. Please go ahead and ask your question. Slight 2 minutes. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, the moderator, Professor, and thank you so much, Kemi, for your presentation. And for me, it's a well-thought presentation and paper. And the good thing you said is work in progress. And my focus would be the following now. One, you are running 3 models, model 1, 2, 3. And to me, they seem to be mixed up in 3 ways. One, my own dissect gave me one board CEO characteristic. Another one was to do with board composition or board, where we have size independence. And then the third cluster would be firm characteristic. Now, for me, if you would run, for example, a model containing only one CEO characteristic, then we see how it fares in employment risk. For example, we look at employment risk, model 1. If you could go to that model and show, and we see that the regression results.
Yeah.
Regression results now.
Yeah.
Okay. Like now, if we have like model 1, your DV is employment risk, and then we see down, you only maintain board size, board independence. It is then we see how does that work. Then model 2, you leave employment risk. Now you bring in CEO network, CEO tenure, CEO age, CEO wealth. Then we see. Then model 3, we look at employment as a DV standing. Then you look at firm size, return on assets, firm risk, and leverage. We see how, because when you look at how those are, they are clustered in 3 ways. We look at the model for each cluster, related to CEO, related to the board, related to the firm. Then model 4 would be perhaps a combined effect of all. Like how you have your model 3 would now be model 4, so that we can see if each one is run alone in a regression, how does it fare?
Yeah.
That is what I saw, and actually it would be a very, very big contribution to see that each one, how each one loads. And equally in your equation, in your model in your equation there, would for example have the equation for one employment risk being a function of CEO characteristic in brackets age, tenure, network wins. Then model 2 employment risk with, for example, board size, board independence. Model 3 we have, for example, employment risk, which is a function of return on assets, firm risk, firm size, stock price, etc. Now, secondly, when you look at this model, initially you had something to do with stock price. Now, stock price is not it does not appear, or you are calling it leverage, maybe, I don't know. You let me on that. Because I saw stock price, but now here I am looking at leverage. I don't know whether stock price and leverage are used interchangeably, or if it is going to be published paper, whether somebody understand that leverage replaces stock price. Then thirdly, Kemi, when you talk of CEO characteristics, we look at tenure. Don't you think that maybe the CEO qualification would also be important? His qualification? What about his experience? Because experience, I had the professor vouching you how you have worked on boards, whatever. That is now part of experience. Don't you think also this CEO's experience in rated assignment could also be part and parcel of his employment longevity or risk? What about his qualification, PhD, master's, 1 degree? Don't you think perhaps also it has an issue to do with that how affecting the DV? Think about those two others in addition to the CEO characteristics. Those are some of my key questions, Professor. I thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you indeed. That's right for those observations. And the observations plus constructive suggestions, and also especially suggestions about the alternative specification of the empirical model, or know how to proceed on the empirical modeling in such a way that one can be able to isolate the measurement of a variable in different ways. And that's very interesting also from the perspective of the additional empirical work that Kemi and the author, co-author, will embark on as they continue to revise. Of course, this was like general specific modeling in which some of the variables initially in the empirical specification may have not got their way into the empirical form. But let's have further discussion and further questions. I can see Tolu's hand up. Tolu, you are welcome to ask our questions.
Yeah, thank you, Victor, and congratulations to Kemi on this very interesting paper.
Thank you.
Especially given that you are moving away, not away, but you are moving towards quantitative rather than in the usual linguistics. My comment relates to the previous comment regarding a CEO network. You were advised to look at qualification. If and while you are doing that, can you also look at where they actually got their degrees from? Because it has been established in the literature that perhaps people, CEOs, for example, from Cambridge, Oxford, they are well connected relative to others. But my main issue relates to how you dealt with endogeneity.
Okay.
the table you presented, the issue was with CO network. You don't have to go. I'm looking at that table, so leave it there.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm actually interested in this table. Okay, your justification for using for repeating the analysis was because, as you said, the CO network was not significant. Okay, and it is one of the variables that you are interested in addition to both sides. But I'm at a loss whether the variable you use as instrumental variable can actually instrument for CO network. Even for both sides, I'm not sure that you actually motivated the use of that average group network as a reliable variable, instrumental variable for both sides. Assuming your qualitative discussion is valid, one will also expect that you provide quantitative support for the instrumental variable in terms of evaluating the weakness or otherwise of this variable, so that one can rely on the results. I think those are my comments at this stage, but the most important one, as I said, is how you dealt with endogeneity. I'm not that convinced about the variable that you used. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tolu. Very useful observations and comments, both on the alternative measurements of variables and also on the question of endogeneity. The literature on endogeneity, as you know, is changing very fast, and there are quite a lot of innovations that researchers are making to addressing endogeneity and to especially take on board the Rudman critique of the fact that the choice of so many other, of many instruments may actually create problems in itself by having instruments that supplant the key variables in the model, and therefore you have a large size of instruments that you substitute out in a given model. There is also attempts to be able to undertake additional empirical procedures that in order to generate a variable that then is used as an endogenous variable. Maybe we should, I don't know whether Kemi, you would like to offer some responses both to a slight question and comments, and also Tolu, before I call upon Kieran to give his comments.
Yes, thank you very much, Victor. Thank you, Sulat, for those very, very useful comments. Actually, like you suggested, running regressions to hold other variables constant and to look at the various variable, both farm characteristics, the independent variable that we're interested in, and the other control variables like farm size and the rest of them. It's very, very useful. We actually ran all of those regression, but we didn't bring them in. But I think it's useful, and I think it's something that I will go back to my co-authors to talk about. You mentioned something about the stock price that you didn't see it in the model. You only use the stock price to determine whether to give one, to measure employment risk. So when we're measuring employment risk, we gave one to if stock price has declined over 2 years in conjunction with other profitability measures, then we give it a 1. So that was where we use stock price. We didn't use it in the model. But perhaps you can also bring it into the model as one of the control variables. we'll consider that and see how it goes. Now, let me come back to Tolu. And okay, yes, so Sunayat as well, the qualification and experience is also very relevant, and I'm sure we are going to work on that as well. Like I said, it's a very, very raw paper, although we started working on it around 2017, and then we abandoned it and went on other, because there were so many queries when I presented it at a conference. So we just abandoned it and went into other papers, and suddenly we decided to bring it up again. And that's why we reran the regression, updated the data, and we are still working on it. And we are really going to see it through to publication this time. And I would like to share it with as many people that are interested in reading the contents and to get your feedback if possible. So thank you so much for those comments. Now to Tolu, very, very brilliant and good suggestion as well with regards to adding the institution and also the group network. I must confess that aspect was done by my co-author. As you know, I'm a multidisciplinary researcher. I use quantitative as well as linguistic. It's just that I champion the linguistic aspect more because it's novel. But then I'm also quant. If you look at my work, you will notice that I've done both quant and qualitative. So, but my quant is not so strong, and so I leave that aspect to my co-author. So I will go back to talk about this endogeneity. I can't really explain or justify why we decided to use the group network, but my co-author feel that is the right one to use. But then I'll go back to her to tell her this was queried, and then we'll look at it again to see which we can bring in. Okay, so I think I have answered those queries. So I just want to say thank you once again for those feedback. They are very, very constructive, and they would help this paper a lot.
Yeah, thank you, Kemi, for appreciating the comments by Slight Tumine from Makerere University Business School, and also from our very own Toru on those observations. And I think Slight was, and also Toru, both of them were exceptionally helpful, especially pointing to the question of CEO qualifications. So that's something that I think will trickle through into the next phase of the paper. Okay, and also the point by Tolu, in fact, on semiotics. You've done, Kemi, absolutely, path-breaking work on semiotics. And I was thinking that maybe, did we miss an opportunity of getting you measure one of these variables using semiotics, turn it into a quantitative number, and then add it here as a regressor? Maybe, which then would, of course, enhance the kind of combination of the, maybe that's absolutely possible, especially on some of the measures. And I think actually the stock price, which was raised, is the standard measure of risk, a firm risk, whereby you are either taking, these deviations from the fluctuations of stock prices, or you are using a gauge process to measure a firm risk. The only what appeared very peculiar was that it's measured at the end of the fiscal year. Maybe other variables are also measured in a fiscal perspective rather than an annual calendar, something that could be tested in the robustness checks. Yeah. Okay. Yes. This is again Kirian. Kirian, please go ahead and share your ideas with us.
Thank you, Victor, and thank you, Kemi, for giving us an opportunity to think about these very interesting questions. I think that actually employment risk is a very going to be an increasingly important and interesting topic. I'm surprised, in fact, that it hasn't come to the fore more, because tenure has been shortening very much right across the world, not just in the Anglosphere, but also in coordinated market economies as well. And it does seem to be that CEOs are perpetually in fear of their jobs these days, with targets based on the share price. But I think I've got a broad comment and some narrow suggestions about variables. But my broad comment would be that there's at least two broad frameworks for understanding what happens under corporate governance, and one of these is, and both of them relate to managers feeling the heat from the board. So one framework is the shareholder value theory, principal agent, and so on, which we know quite well, and has been with us for many decades. And monitoring the CEO is good, even if it scares them, even if it increases their likelihood of being fired. That's one way of looking at things. Increasingly, that framework is being abandoned and criticized by a large and interesting literature that criticizes shareholder value theory. And along with it, the high compensation culture, the bonus culture, and so on, that seeks to incentivize CEOs. And they think that this framework thinks that effectively this is destroying the real economy. It is focusing managers on short-term decisions, the obsession with the share price, resulting in, as Cam Harvey showed in the Journal of Financial Economics some years ago, and we're all aware now, that results in managers managing earnings and reducing R&D and other real expenditures in order to satisfy shareholders. Now, these are quite different perspectives on the whole process of corporate governance, and it's not clear that we can talk about effectiveness of corporate governance without actually saying what one of these that we're actually following at any point in time. But in the first case, of course, scaring managers would be good. In the second case, scaring managers would simply be dangerous. And one of the articles I published with Maria Guedes just a few years ago in Industrial and Corporate Change showed that this kind of pressure on managers, in the case of the UK top 100, FTSE 100, certainly reduces R&D and R&D expenditure and likelihood of undertaking innovative steps. So I'm just concerned about bringing in these broader pictures so that we can understand more how it is that that executives are being under pressure here. The second point, as I said, relates to just a couple of things about variables. So I was thinking about the way that you defined employment risk for CEOs. One of the worries would be, I mean, I think it's quite right that the stock market, I mean, you know, if they don't satisfy the stock market or earnings per share, then they're out. I mean, that's what they have to do. So I think that that's undoubtedly related to it. But on the other hand, you do have a problem of endogeneity, describing it in terms of risk this way. I'm not sure how good a predictor it would be, those two variables. And then you have ROA appears both in the definition of risk of being fired, and it also appears in the list of independent variables that you've got later on. So maybe moving on to your second alternative, I would also have some worries about that, because if a CEO has already been fired in the organization in the last 5 years, it will look a little bit bad on the organization to fire another one. I mean, it will mean there are processes of appointing the, you know, it's the same thing with Boris Johnson had with his Chancellor of the Exchequer. If you fire two of them, you look as if you're not a very good decision maker in the first place. So I was wondering whether it was impossible simply to look at CEOs who have been fired. It's hard to find this information. In our ICC piece, we had to look at press coverage to find them. But you can find cases where undoubtedly you know that CEOs have been fired, and then you can, therefore, before in the immediate preceding years, you can be pretty sure that these CEOs knew that they were under pressure for being fired, and those would constitute a sample that you could then perhaps use. The other final point is on the independent variables. So I was just thinking that in terms of I think you're using independent, the number of independent directors is a good one in terms of how sharply focused the board is simply on shareholder value and making sure that these managers follow, dance to the tune of shareholder value. I think independent directors do that much more than non-execs do it more than others. But I also think that ownership matters, so that when the ownership of the shares is in the hands of some kinds of institutional investors, then it puts more pressure on managers to follow the shareholder value idea. Anyway, I'll leave it there. Sorry, I've taken up a bit of time.
Sorry, before you go, Kieran, you mentioned a paper you did some years with a colleague. What's the title of that paper?
That was, I've just looked it up to remind myself, R&D and CEO departure date. Do financial incentives make CEOs more opportunistic? So it was looking at tenure of CEOs and arguing that as they approached their retirement age, they actually had an interest in getting the share price up because their stock options would be worth more. And one way of doing that was to reduce R&D expenditure. And we found that they did the more they were rewarded by stock options and high-powered incentives, the more they were likely to actually end up doing this short-term step of reducing R&D.
So that's R&D. Do financial what? Do financial incentives?
R&D and CEO departure date. Do financial incentives make CEOs more opportunistic?
Okay.
Yeah, thanks very much, Kieran. Maybe Kieran, you could be kind enough to email that reference to Kemi.
Yeah, I'll email it to you, Kemi.
Yeah. Thanks very much. And we know, Kieran, this is your area of work, and the volume, the book that you produced some time back with colleagues is still one of the leading books on understanding corporate governance. So we thank you for those helpful observations and constructive suggestions. Yeah, okay.
A very useful suggestion. Thank you.
Okay, so let me now call upon Hong. Hong is also a researcher in the area of corporate governance. And Hong, please, if you could share your observations with us.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much, Victor. And also thanks for Kemi for the very clear presentation. I understand everything. So my comments is about the empirical model specification. And that is actually related to your measurement of riskiness of CEO being fired. Yeah. You use the first one, you use the stock market performance, and you use a categorical variable rather than volatility of the stock market return themselves. So even that, I would say this is the indicator that people often use for firm performance. So your logic is if firms' stock market is not performing well and they do not perform well for consistently for 2 years, then the CEO faces a higher risk of being fired. So my question is, on the right-hand side, you do not have anything about characteristics or factors that can affect the stock market performance apart from very basic firm characteristics and some very basic CEO characteristics. So think about the impact of the Ukraine war on the stock market performance. During this period, firms, they are not going to perform well because of the volatility of the whole setting. So my question is whether or not you need to control for some macro variables as well, in addition to the variables that you considered already. And I remember very clearly, so when we had a paper on corporate governance, on board characteristics, and the referee asked us, you need to control three sets of variables. One is the firm, including CEO themselves, and the other set of variables should be related to the industry. And the third one should be taken from the macroeconomic environment. So I think if you submit this one to some journals, I would expect people will comment on this. It's not about the CEO themselves. It's about the firm performance, particularly when you use a firm performance indicator as a proxy for CEO's employment risk. So my comments applies to first indicator more than your second indicator, because in your second indicator, you actually used whether or not they fired some CEO previously. But even so, there may be some other macro factors or industry-related factors that are relevant in explaining this. So that's basically my comments. So I think you can improve by considering, industry level, macro level variables, so that you can purify the impact of board effectiveness on on CEO employment risk. So that's my comment.
Thank you so much. I'll allow Victor to talk. Well, thank you so much, Hong, for those comments. They are very, very constructive and useful. And yeah, we'll take them on board. But let me get something clear. You said you know when you said we use stock price, remember it is not just the market price, market performance that we are looking at now. We are looking at if that happens consecutively for 2 years, and at the same time there is decline also in accounting measure of profitability. So we are looking at it in conjunction with that. We are not just saying market performance alone. So we are saying if there is poor performance on the market and at the same time poor performance of accounting measure, then we are kind of saying, well, the CEO has a question to answer with that, and that's why we use that as a measure. Yeah, what else was that?
Yeah, but still my comment applies, I think, because no matter, whether you use a dummy or use the stock market performance itself, or you use the accounting performance, they are all related to the bigger environment apart from CEO themselves.
Yeah. Yes, I get the point about including macroeconomic variable, industry, yeah. Okay, thank you so much for that.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thanks, Hong, and yes, very constructive suggestions and helpful observations, and especially on the measurement of variables. Jeffrey.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you very well.
All right. Thank you, Kemi, for this paper. Very interesting, and especially for adding the quantitative part, which is not what you normally find in this sort of study. I just want to add to the point made by Hung is about the macro environment. My point is on competition, because when it comes to both performance and pressure on CEO, competition is very, very important. So I think you can add this as one of the control variables. Or, and I understand your paper is based on UK, which is a single market only, which may make that a bit difficult in terms of comparing competition. But you can also use the industry competitive index, which you can find on both World Bank and IMF website. I think this would, be very, very important, the industry competitiveness. Again, thank you for the paper.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jeffrey. Very, very good. That's a good suggestion. Industry competitive index. Very good suggestion. Thank you so much.
Okay. I can see Juliet.
Juliet. Okay, thank you, Professor. And thank you, Professor Kemi. I just thought that this was an excellent presentation, actually. And for me, that's, as a new researcher, I think you did an excellent job in not just presenting and teaching us about something, but you also taught me at the same time. So I thought that was excellent. Thank you. And for me, it's just a thought that came to mind, because when I think of boards, I don't know when other people think of boards. Maybe you think of a male CEO. And recently, organizations, even the FT350, have been challenged to diversify their boards. So I wonder actually if more women are on boards, whether corporate governance does have this tendency to create the CEO risk actually. I know it will be difficult because maybe the data is not there because you don't have many women on boards at the moment, but I just thought it could be an interesting gap in your paper that for future researchers, because I think it will be very informative for women's studies, etc., to understand actually this poor performance. Do we see that predominantly with women CEOs? I don't know yet, but I think the world is moving to having a more diverse board, and perhaps that actually in terms of performance may be looked at differently. So just a thought for me. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Juliet. Actually, not only female on board, we might even want to check female CEOs to see either whether poor performance or risk of employment is more likely for female CEO than male CEOs, or, yeah, that's very good. Thank you so much.
Yeah, yes, indeed, Juliet. I too thank you that the gender dimension could enter on both the CEO and also on the board composition. I don't see any further hands. I still see the hand of Kirian. I see the hand of Hong. I see the hand of Jeffrey, but maybe these are legacy hands from the previous comments, unless, of course, they want to come back. Kirian, are you trying to come back, or this is from, okay, it's from the previous, yeah. So, Kemi, this has been absolutely helpful. I think the first is to draw attention to the question of CEO employment risk. That in itself is, a great a milestone, which can refocus energies, and then to try to address that question within a corporate governance framework. And there has also been many good comments on exploring further the measures of CO characteristics to diversify away from rather some of the measures used here, expanding qualifications, gender, and I think that's a point in the right direction, which gives you quite a way of expanding the work. Now, on the empirical model, I think there have been so many constructive comments, and which will motivate you into exploring alternative empirical specification of the model. But let me also add two things which may appear obvious or apparent, but maybe which one may want to think of. The first is that in the empirical specification of this model, both in the specification and also in the empirical results, there is an implicit assumption of linearity. Is linear. Yeah, but as we know, modern methods allow us to be able to explore the dimension of nonlinearity. Assume that maybe where you have, variables, especially the explanatory variables changing, they may change in a nonlinear form and take either a U-shape or inverted U-shape. Things with, for example, between, say, board size and performance, and where, for example, maybe, at performance increases initially with size, but eventually board size might be a problem and therefore performance declines, which would be something like an inverted U. So I think it's relatively straightforward with the sort of variables you have on the right-hand side to have to introduce a contrast term and then explore the nature of nonlinearity. Maybe there is, maybe there isn't. So that would have to be a strictly empirical question as you run the regressions. Now, my second observations I'd like to make on the specification, which observation has not been mentioned before, is to explore that some of the variables on your right-hand side tend to interact, and therefore try to explore whether there is an interaction term that may appear, for example, between farm size and CO tenure. That basically your farm size is very important, but it also depends on whether the CO has been, say, in that farm for such a long time that there is an interaction, in which case maybe the size actually has been achieved by the persistence or the long-term nature of the CO. So there are also more than a couple of variables where you explore the possibility of interaction and to see whether the empirical results will bear out the interaction. Yeah, I come back to this, maybe trying to prompt you, Kemi, because this is work that you've done in so many papers before of semiotic measurement of looking at the statements made and then combining them in an algorithm, then convert it into a number that can add into your data for classification. For example, there are measures of CO employment risk that you have introduced here, but also maybe say the communication by CEO, maybe we can get that measure from a communication by CEO, or maybe it would be in a communication from the board, or maybe it is in a communication from the media who are attacking the CEO of a certain organization. Most people thinks that it's been attacked so much that he's going to resign, but of course he doesn't resign. Okay, so because what it is that your paper would then depart from the mainstream papers, the other main papers that have been in vogue, and try to send a dimension in which we can combine information, especially if the empirical results bear out that hypothetical relationship. By the way, I like very much the way you specified your hypothesis. They are a very good example of how hypothesis should be set, on field. Very, very clear and testable. But in the measurement, maybe one of the critical variables, like CO employment risk, could be done both using the actual data from observation, secondary data, but also maybe alternative data that results are robust to the use of data, whether you use secondary data for the econometrics, whether you use semiotics data and try to test, you find that maybe the result does not change. Maybe it does change. We don't know until we have tried it out. But fantastic work. And for me, absolutely thought-provoking. I just, I personally wish you good luck, and also on behalf of CGF, wish you good luck, and see how this the paper will come out after this iteration. And so, yeah, maybe I can give you 2 minutes before I close.
Yeah, thank you so much, Victor, for those brilliant suggestions. Especially the use of semiotic. You know, when Kiran was suggesting that we could also measure employment risk by looking at previous CEO that has been fired and to see whether they were under pressure. You know, this is one of the areas that we can use semiotic to measure. We can see, you know, past statements, whether from the press or from even the director's reports, if they have mentioned anything to suggest that they have put the previous CEO under pressure. I mean, one can semiotically analyze that. Yeah, very good comment, and I'm so happy that I presented this paper here today, and I'm sure if I take this back to my co-author, she'll be very glad that we discussed the paper here today. So a lot of comments, a lot of feedback, a lot of very brilliant suggestions that I believe will improve the paper. Yeah, I might present it again once we bring in some of these suggestions. I might want to present it again just to see how it's.
Absolutely, you are most welcome. That's what these seminars are here for. A good atmosphere for exchanging views, rethinking the work, the ongoing work, with the view of enhancing the quality, and then going forward to powerful journals. So let me thank you once again, and most fundamentally, Kemi, for this interesting work. Let me also thank the participants who have been able to make it to this meeting, and for also the comments that have been shared generously with Kemi and we, all of us, and think also impacting on some of the work we are doing. So thank you indeed, and we look forward to another CGF seminar next week, same time. But for now, let me say goodbye, and thanks saying here. Thanks everybody.
Everyone.
Thanks indeed.